No one inside that training hall expected history to walk in that day. The room was quiet, too quiet. Like it knew something legendary was about to happen. On one side stood Chuck Norris. Tall, solid. A man whose presence alone commanded respect. His black belt rested neatly at his waist, his posture calm but unbreakable. Every move he made carried the weight of discipline, years of championships, and a reputation built on pure power. On the other side, the door slowly opened. A lean figure stepped inside. Simple clothes, relaxed shoulders, eyes sharp but peaceful. Bruce Lee. There was no dramatic music, no announcement, just a sudden shift in the air, like the room itself held its breath. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Even the most experienced fighters froze. Everyone knew what this meant. Two philosophies, two legends. Zone moment. Chuck Norris turned his head slightly. Bruce Lee met his gaze. For a second, time felt suspended. No smiles, no nods. Just pure awareness. This wasn't about ego. This wasn't about proving who was stronger. This was something deeper. Something unspoken. People whispered from the corners of the room. Is this really happening? Are they going to spar? Who do you think would win? Bruce Lee slowly removed his jacket and placed it aside with care. His movements were fluid, effortless, like water finding its path. Chuck Norris remained still, grounded like a mountain, his stance solid and unreadable. The contrast was striking. Speed versus strength, flow versus force, adaptation versus control. Single step forward from Bruce Lee made the room tense. A subtle shift in Chuck Norris's stance sent a ripple of anticipation through everyone watching. Cameras quietly came out. Hearts started racing. This wasn't a movie scene. This wasn't choreography. This was real. A senior instructor tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. He knew better than to interrupt. Moments like this couldn't be scripted. Bruce Lee's eyes softened, but his focus sharpened. Chuck Norris exhaled slowly, completely composed. Then Bruce Lee said quietly, just loud enough for Chuck to hear, "Let's see what truth feels like." Chuck Norris didn't reply with words, he replied with a stance. And in that instant, everyone in the room understood something powerful. Whatever was about to happen next, martial arts would never be looked at the same way again. The training hall wasn't just a room. It was a place where discipline lived and egos were left at the door. Wooden floors polished by decades of practice reflected the soft overhead lights. The walls were lined with weapons, belts, and framed photos of champions who had passed through these doors. Yet on this day, none of those legends mattered. Because two living legends were standing face to face. Chuck Norris remained rooted to the ground, his breathing steady, his posture flawless. He wasn't tense, but he wasn't relaxed either. Years of competition had taught him one thing: respect the opponent, no matter who they are. His eyes followed Bruce Lee closely, reading every movement, every shift in weight. Bruce Lee, meanwhile, seemed almost casual. He rolled his shoulders once, loosening them, as if preparing for a light jog rather than a confrontation that had everyone else frozen in place. His feet barely made a sound against the wooden floor. He moved like he belonged everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The crew members lining the walls exchanged nervous glances. Some had trained for years, yet none of them felt worthy to witness this moment. A few younger fighters swallowed hard, suddenly questioning everything they thought they knew about combat. This wasn't just a sparring session. This was a meeting of minds. Chuck Norris represented structure, discipline, power refined through repetition. Every strike he ever threw had a purpose. Every movement was economical, efficient, and tested in real competition. Bruce Lee represented freedom flow, a rejection of rigid styles. He believed in adapting to the moment, in becoming formless, unpredictable, like water, two paths, one floor. A senior instructor finally broke the silence. His voice was careful, almost trembling. "Gentlemen, this is only a controlled session." Bruce Lee smiled faintly, not looking away from Chuck. "Of course." Chuck Norris nodded once. No arguments. no bravado. But everyone in the room knew, controlled or not, something unforgettable was about to unfold. Bruce Lee stepped forward, stopping just a few feet away. His stance was light, almost playful, but his eyes burned with focus. Chuck adjusted his footing by an inch. It was a small movement, but fighters noticed, they always did. The air felt heavy. You could hear breathing. You could hear heartbeats. You could hear fear. One of the younger fighters whispered, "If they clash, who survives that first exchange?" No one answered. Chuck Norris remembered all the opponents he had faced. Strong men, fast men, confident men. But this felt different. Bruce Lee wasn't sizing him up physically. He was studying him. Mentally, Bruce, on the other hand, sensed the raw power beneath Chuck's calm exterior. This wasn't someone you overwhelmed with speed alone. This was someone you respected, or paid for it. For a brief moment, both men shared the same thought. This is not about winning. It's about understanding. Bruce Lee raised his hands slowly, palms open, not aggressive, not defensive, just honest. Chuck mirrored him, settling into a stance that spoke of readiness, not hostility. Around them, cameras rolled silently. History was unfolding, and no one dared to blink. The instructor lifted his hand slightly, then stopped. Even he realized this wasn't his moment to control. Because when two masters meet, rules take a back seat. Bruce Lee shifted his weight forward. Chuck Norris leaned in, and the first real movement was about to begin. The moment finally arrived. Not with a shout, not with a signal, but with a shift so subtle only trained eyes could catch it. Bruce Lee moved first. It wasn't an attack. It was a test. His lead foot slid forward, barely brushing the floor, while his upper body stayed loose, relaxed. To an untrained eye, it looked harmless. To Chuck Norris, there was a question being asked at high speed. Chuck answered without thinking. His stance tightened, center of gravity dropping just enough to anchor him. Years of tournament fighting had sharpened his instincts. He didn't chase Bruce's movement. He waited for it to reveal intent. Bruce circled, light on his feet, changing angles with every step. His hands floated, constantly shifting position, never committing to one guard. Chuck followed him with his eyes only, conserving motion, conserving energy. Then Bruce exploded forward. A blur of motion faster than most people believed possible. His fist snapped toward Chuck's chest, stopping just an inch away. The sound of displaced air cracked sharply. Gasps echoed through the hall. But Chuck hadn't flinched. He blocked. Not with panic, not with force, but with precision. His forearm rose at the last possible moment, redirecting the strike away from his body. The contact was light, controlled, but real. Bruce's lips curved into the faintest smile. He hadn't been testing Chuck's reflexes. He'd been testing his nerve. Bruce pulled back instantly, flowing into a sidestep. Without pause, he followed with a low kick aimed at Chuck's lead leg, fast, sharp, designed to disrupt balance. Chuck reacted by shifting his weight backward, lifting his leg just enough to let the kick pass harmlessly beneath him. His counter came immediately. A powerful round kick that cut through the space Bruce had occupied a heartbeat earlier. But Bruce wasn't there anymore. He had already moved. The fighters watching could barely keep up. This wasn't about who could hit harder or faster. It was about timing, distance, and control. Every exchange ended just short of impact, like two predators circling, measuring each other's reach. Bruce feinted high. Chuck didn't bite. Chuck stepped forward suddenly, closing the distance in a way Bruce hadn't expected. For the first time, Bruce's eyes widened. Just a fraction. Chuck's presence was overwhelming up close. His power coiled and ready. Bruce slipped sideways, letting Chuck's momentum carry past him, and tapped Chuck's shoulder lightly with two fingers. Not a strike. A message. I was there. A murmur rippled through the room. Chuck turned, resetting instantly. His expression hadn't changed, but inside, something had shifted. Bruce Lee wasn't just fast. He was precise to a frightening degree. Bruce, too, was recalculating. Chuck Norris wasn't stiff or predictable like many powerful fighters. He adapted. He learned quickly. The pace increased. Bruce unleashed a rapid combination, Jab, cross, low kick, each one stopping short, each one probing for a weakness. Chuck blocked, parried, stepped back, then suddenly surged forward with a straight punch that cut the air like a blade. Bruce leaned back just enough to avoid it, feeling the force pass inches from his face. That punch would have ended the session. Ivrion knew it. Silence filled the hall, broken only by controlled breathing. Both men paused, not because they were tired, but because they were thinking. This wasn't sparring anymore. Bruce straightened, lowering his hand slightly. Your power. It's honest, he said calmly. Chuck nodded once. And your movement, it doesn't lie. They resumed. But slower now. More deliberate. Each exchange carried respect. Each step was measured. Then Bruce did something unexpected. He stopped completely. Chuck halted as well, instantly alert. Bruce smiled, not as a challenger, but as a student. If I rush, he said softly, I lose what matters. Chuck understood. This wasn't about proving dominance. It was about discovering truth. About seeing how two different paths could meet without collision. The room felt lighter somehow, as if everyone had just exhaled together. The conflict hadn't ended in victory or defeat. It had ended in understanding. But the biggest shock was still to come. Because what Bruce Lee would do next, no one in that hall had ever seen before. For a long moment, no one moved. The wooden floor that had echoed with rapid footwork only seconds ago now felt frozen in time. Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris stood a few feet apart, facing each other in complete silence. Their breathing was slow, controlled, almost synchronized. It was as if the entire room had unconsciously matched their rhythm. The fighters along the walls didn't dare whisper anymore. Something had changed. This was no longer about testing speed or measuring power. Whatever had just passed between Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris was invisible, yet unmistakable. An understanding that words could never fully explain. Bruce lowered his hands completely, not in surrender, not in weakness, but in awareness. A few of the younger fighters looked at one another in confusion. To them, lowering your guard meant giving up an opening, but the older instructors knew better. They had seen this before, rarely, and only between masters. Chuck Norris noticed it instantly. His muscles stayed engaged, but his posture softened just a fraction. He didn't attack. He didn't advance. He waited. That patience spoke louder than any strike. Bruce took a slow step back, then another, increasing the distance between them. His eyes never left Chuck's. He wasn't retreating. He was creating space to think. The room held its breath again. One of the senior instructors cleared his throat softly, then stopped himself. Even he sensed that interrupting this moment would be a mistake. Bruce turned his head slightly, glancing around the room. Dozens of eyes were locked on him. Some filled with awe, some with confusion, some with fear of missing what came next. He looked back at Chuck. Most people think fighting is about contact, Bruce said quietly. His voice wasn't loud, yet it carried effortlessly through the hall. But contact is only the surface. Chuck listened without moving. It's about timing, Bruce continued. Intention, awareness. If you don't understand those, you're just swinging. A murmur passed through the room, but no one dared interrupt. Chuck nodded slowly. And if you don't respect power, he replied, you get pulled into mistakes. Bruce smiled. Not a grin. An expression of genuine respect. The tension that had once felt sharp now felt focused. Bruce suddenly shifted his stance again, light and loose, as if returning to motion after a pause. But this time there was no aggression in it. He moved in a slow circle, demonstrating rather than challenging. Chuck mirrored him, maintaining distance, his eyes sharp but calm. To the spectators, it looked like a dance. Each step Bruce took, Chuck answered. Each angle Chuck closed, Bruce flowed away from. They weren't trying to hit each other anymore. They were showing each other something. The realization hit the room almost all at once. This wasn't a fight. This was a lesson. Bruce stopped again directly in front of Chuck. He raised his hand, not to strike, but to gesture. Your base, he said thoughtfully, is like a wall. Solid. If I crash into it, I lose. Chuck responded just as calmly. And if I chase you, he said, I lose my balance. Several instructors exchanged stunned looks. They were witnessing something deeper than technique. They were witnessing humility. Bruce nodded, eyes thoughtful. Then the answer isn't force or speed. Chuck finished the thought. It's control. A quiet wave of realization swept through the room. The younger fighters felt it first, a shift in how they understood combat. This wasn't about choosing sides anymore. This was about seeing the whole picture. Bruce exhaled slowly, then did something no one expected. He bowed, not deeply, not dramatically, just enough to show acknowledgement. The room froze. Chuck Norris, without hesitation, returned the bow. That single gesture landed harder than any punch thrown earlier. Somewhere in the back, a camera clicked by accident. No one turned, no one broke the moment. Bruce straightened and took a step back. His expression peaceful. Chuck remained still, respectful, grounded. The air in the hall felt lighter now, almost calm. But the shock wasn't over, because Bruce Lee was about to say something that would change how everyone in that room understood martial arts forever. And when he spoke again, even Chuck Norris would pause. Bruce Lee stood still after the bow, his hands resting naturally at his sides. The room was so quiet that even the hum of the overhead lights felt loud. Every eye was fixed on him, waiting, almost afraid, to hear what he would say next. He looked at Chuck Norris, not as an opponent, but as a mirror. Most people think strength is about winning, Bruce said calmly, about dominating the other person. A few heads in the crowd nodded instinctively. That was what they had been taught. That was what competitions rewarded. Bruce shook his head slowly. But real strength, he continued, is knowing when you don't need to win. The words settled over the room like a weight. Chuck Norris felt them land. He had fought across the world, faced champions, defended titles. Victory had always mattered. But this was something different. Bruce took a step closer, closing the distance until they were standing almost face to face again. There was no tension now, no threat, only focus. You see, Bruce said, if I attack you with speed alone, I lose. If you attack me with power alone, you lose. The crowd leaned forward as one. So what happens? Bruce asked. When neither of us plays that game? Chuck Norris didn't answer immediately. He looked at Bruce carefully, then glanced around the room. Dozens of fighters, instructors, students, all waiting. Then Chuck smiled, just slightly. Not the kicks, not the speed, not the power. That single exchange, quiet, honest, hit harder than anything else that day. Bruce nodded, visibly satisfied. He turned slightly so the room could hear him clearly. Styles are limits, he said. Power is a tool. Speed is a tool. But awareness has no style. Some of the younger fighters felt a chill run through them. Everything they thought they understood was being challenged. Bruce gestured toward Chuck. This man is strong because he respects his base. He doesn't waste movement. He doesn't chase illusions. Chuck, in return, spoke with the same respect. And this man, he said, is dangerous because he doesn't fight what's in front of him. He fights what's coming. The room erupted, not in noise, but in realization. This wasn't a rivalry revealed. It was something far more powerful. A partnership of understanding. Bruce suddenly shifted his stance once more. Not fast, not aggressive, but demonstrative. Watch, he said. He moved toward Chuck. Slowly this time, deliberately stepping into range. Chuck didn't react. He didn't block. He didn't counter. Bruce stopped just inches away. If I strike now, Bruce explained, I win the moment and lose the lesson. He stepped back. Chuck exhaled. And if I strike, he added, I prove strength, but miss growth. A senior instructor near the wall closed his eyes briefly, overwhelmed. Years of teaching, years of rules and systems had just been rewritten in minutes. Bruce turned back to Chuck and extended his hand. Not to challenge, not to compete, to acknowledge. Chuck took it firmly. The handshake wasn't flashy, it wasn't dramatic, but it was real. Cameras clicked openly now. No one tried to hide it anymore. Everyone understood they were witnessing something historic. Bruce spoke one final line, his voice calm but firm. Today, he said, we didn't fight. Chuck finished it. We evolved. The room finally released its breath. People whispered, not about who would win, but about what they had just learned. Fighters looked at their own hands differently now. Instructors stared at the floor, rethinking decades of tradition. This was the shock knot. A knockout, not a defeat, but a realization that true mastery has nothing to prove. And as Bruce Lee turned to leave the floor, everyone knew. They hadn't just watched two legends meet. They had watched martial arts change. The training hall slowly came back to life, but nothing felt the same anymore. People shifted their weight, exhaled deeply, and looked around as if waking from a shared dream. Conversations didn't start right away. No one rushed forward. No one clapped. The moment didn't call for noise. It demanded reflection. Bruce Lee stepped away from the center of the floor, but he didn't leave. Instead, he moved toward the edge where a few wooden benches rested against the wall. Chuck Norris followed, not as an opponent trailing behind, but as a fellow traveler continuing the same path. The senior instructors exchanged glances, then quietly nodded to one another. Without a word, they understood the session wasn't over. It had simply changed form. Bruce sat down casually, resting his forearms on his knees. Chuck remained standing for a moment, then sat beside him. The image alone felt surreal, two legends, not facing off, but sitting side by side like students after a long lesson. Bruce broke the silence first. When I was younger, he said thoughtfully, I wanted to prove myself. I wanted to be faster, sharper, better than everyone else. Chuck listened intently. But the more I learned, Bruce continued, the more I realized, fighting isn't about showing what you have, it's about discovering what you don't. Chuck nodded slowly. Competition taught me discipline, he said, but it also taught me limits, rules, points, expectations. Bruce glanced at him. Limits are useful, he said, until they become cages. That line struck the room quietly but deeply. A few instructors moved closer, careful not to intrude. Students leaned forward, sensing that this conversation was just as important as the movement they had witnessed earlier. Chuck folded his hands together. When you moved earlier, he admitted, I felt something unusual, not fear, awareness. Like chasing you would pull me out of myself. Bruce smiled. And when you didn't chase, he replied, I learned something. Power doesn't need to rush. They both fell silent again, letting the lesson settle. Then Bruce stood. He walked back to the center of the floor and turned to face the room. Chuck followed, rising more slowly but just as purposefully. This ends here, Bruce said, gesturing around the hall. If you think what you saw was about us, you missed it. Every head lifted. It was about you, he continued. About how you train, about how you think, about whether you fight your opponent or yourself. Chuck added, his voice steady and clear. Strength without awareness is noise. Awareness without strength is fragile. Mastery lives between the two. The room felt charged, not with adrenaline, but with clarity. One of the younger fighters raised a hesitant hand. So who won? He asked quietly. Bruce and Chuck exchanged a glance. Bruce answered first. If you're asking that, he said gently, you're still looking at the surface. Chuck finished the thought. And if you're still looking for a winner, he added, you're missing the point. A ripple of understanding passed through the group. Bruce nodded once. Train to understand, he said, not to dominate. Chuck followed. Train to respect, he said, not to impress. The instructors bowed deeply, not out of tradition, but gratitude. Bruce picked up his jacket and turned toward the exit. Chuck walked beside him. At the door, they stopped. Bruce looked at Chuck one last time. This wasn't a meeting of styles, he said. Chuck replied softly. It was a meeting of minds. They clasped hands briefly, firm, respectful. And then Bruce Lee stepped out into the sunlight. The door closed behind him, inside the hall. No one spoke for a long time. They didn't need to. Because the resolution wasn't about who stood tallest at the end. It was about what stood taller inside everyone who witnessed it. And as Chuck Norris looked around the room, he realized something profound. That day, no one had lost. But everyone had changed. The training hall remained quiet long after Bruce Lee had left. No one rushed to grab their bags. No one joked or compared techniques. The air still carried the weight of what had just happened, an invisible echo of understanding that refused to fade. Some moments don't end when the people leave. They stay, settling into the walls, into memory. Chuck Norris stood alone near the center of the floor. He looked at the space where Bruce Lee had stood earlier, replaying every movement in his mind. Not the speed, not the power, but the intention behind it. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like a competitor reviewing a match. He felt like a student. Around him, the fighters slowly gathered their thoughts. A young man tightened his belt, then loosened it again, realizing how symbolic that gesture suddenly felt. An older instructor stared at his reflection in the mirrored wall, questioning years of rigid teaching. No one spoke, but everyone was learning. Chuck finally turned to the group. "What you witnessed today," he said calmly, "was not a fight." The room focused instantly. "It was a reminder," he continued, "that respect comes before skill, awareness comes before action, and ego comes last." Some heads bowed. Others nodded. Chuck took a slow breath. "If you only train to defeat someone else, you will always be chasing. If you train to understand yourself, you will never be lost." The words landed quietly but firmly. A senior instructor stepped forward. His voice was steady but emotional. "We've taught forms, rules, systems," he said, "but today, we were taught humility." Chuck acknowledged him with a nod. "That's the foundation," Chuck replied. "Without it, everything else is decoration." The fighters began to disperse, but differently than before. Their steps were slower, more thoughtful. Every movement carried intention. One own student paused at the door and looked back. "Sir," he asked, "will we ever see something like that again?" Chuck considered the question carefully. "Only if you stop trying to prove something," he said, "and start trying to learn." The student nodded, understanding more than he could explain. As the hall finally emptied, Chuck gathered his things and prepared to leave. Before turning off the lights, he glanced once more at the training floor. Earlier that day, it had been a battleground of anticipation. Now, it felt like a classroom. Outside, the world moved as it always did. Cars passed, people talked, time continued. But inside those walls, something timeless had taken place. Two legends had met not to conquer, not to compete, but to reflect truth back at one another. And in doing so, they had shown everyone watching that the highest form of strength is restraint, and the deepest form of power is respect. Chuck stepped outside and closed the door behind him. The lesson stayed. Type respect in the comments if you believe humility is real strength.